The relationship that we can illustrate between physicalism and the hard problem of consciousness is particularly important when we explore the metaphysics of death, particularly when we think about discussions relating to what happens when we die, and the important question of whether or not consciousness actually survives. This lesson then is going to explain the hard problem of consciousness and how the hard problem of consciousness contributes to further difficulties for physicalists in relation to the philosophy of death. So let's just begin with a basic recap. Physicalism or materialism holds that reality, all of reality, including mental states and consciousness, is fundamentally composed of physical things, of matter and of energy. The brain is a physical organ, and as a physical organ is responsible for producing things that include the likes of consciousness and mental states. According to this view, then, the consciousness is part of the brain's function. The idea here is that the brain's neural network, chemical processes, and electrical activity generates experiences of thought, of perception, and of awareness. And according to this framework, there is no need to posit anything that exists beyond physical reality and beyond physical matter to explain the phenomenon of the mind. By extension, then, consciousness is just seen as an emergent property of the complex interactions of neurons within the brain. When the brain will then cease to function, when we think about the process of death, then so too does the experiences of consciousness. The experience of consciousness will then also end. According to a strict physicalist, then, death is the cessation of all biological functions and therefore the end of all mental or conscious experience. There is no afterlife, there is no continuation of consciousness beyond the physical death of the body, and ultimately, this shows a clear correlation between, there is no afterlife, and because consciousness itself is entirely dependent on the physical processes of the brain, the moment the brain stops functioning, all subjective experiences cease. Death is the absolute final end. When we think about any kind of neuroscientific underpinnings of this particular question, of this particular concept, modern neuroscience has made significant strides in our understanding of the relationship between the brain and between that and consciousness. So brain activity studies, for example, particularly through things like neuroimaging and other technologies, show that there is a correlation between physical brain states and mental states. For example, damage to specific parts of the brain can result in changes in one's personality, in one's memory, and even in one's ability to experience emotions or even experience pain. What then is the hard problem of consciousness? Well, the hard problem of consciousness refers to the challenge of explaining why and how subjective experiences arise from physical processes in the brain. It is an issue that is distinct from what many call the easy problems of consciousness. So these concern how the brain processes sensory information, how it integrates that information, or how the brain regions contribute to specific mental functions. This is a problem. These are problems that are relatively easy compared to the hard problem of consciousness. Individuals, such as philosophers like David Chalmers, describes the hard problem of consciousness as focusing on the qualitative aspect of experience, the what is it like to be conscious, the subjective feeling of having an experience. For example, while science can explain how light waves interact with the retina and then are processed by the brain, the hard problem of consciousness asks why those processes lead to the specific experience of seeing red. What is it about the firing of neurons in the brain that generates a particular feeling of colour or a particular emotion? These feelings, these subjective things, are sometimes known as qualia. the raw experience of perception that is personal and is inaccessible to anybody else. One way that we can express the hard problem of consciousness is through the explanatory gap, the gap between the physical brain processes and the subjective experience of consciousness. While a scientist and somebody who believes in physicalism would be able to map how the brain works, all the different regions, all the different aspects of consciousness, such as vision and hearing and decision making, they cannot explain how these physical processes can produce the subjective experience of what it is like to feel, to perceive, to think. The fact that subjective experience seems so fundamentally different from anything the physical world presents, for some presents a significant challenge to the idea of physicalism. And so when we think about the hard problem of consciousness, it has profound implications for the philosophy of death. Because if consciousness is fundamentally tied to the physical processes within the brain, as a physicalist would assert, then death must mark the end of this subjective experience. Why does the hard problem of consciousness raise questions about the nature of this? Well, the first problem is the question of whether or not consciousness can be fully explained by physicalism. If we cannot fully explain how subjective experiences arise from the brain, it can cast doubt on whether or not consciousness could ever be fully reduced to physical processes. We know that physicalism asserts that consciousness is nothing more than the operation of brain chemistry and brain science. So neurons, electrical neurons, all these different kinds of things, the chemistry of the brain, hormones, etc., etc. But the hard problem suggests that something more has to be involved in the emergence of subjective experience, or at the very least, the hard problem tells us that the physicalist cannot explain why this subjective experience arises. So if that is the case, then this may open the door to questions about whether or not consciousness could persist after death, potentially in a non-physical form, and questions about the soul. So one possibility that arises from the hard problem is that while the brain is the primary generator of consciousness, it is not clear whether or not consciousness ceases entirely when the brain stops functioning. The physical cessation of the brain could mean the end of the specific mental states associated with that particular individual, but what about just the possibility that some form of consciousness could survive death? For example, some have suggested that consciousness could exist in a different non-material form after death of the brain, or could be transferred in some way. And this brings us into not only religious and spiritual conversations about the afterlife or reincarnation, but also it could bring us into the conversation about technological advances. What about the technological transference of consciousness from one body into another, or from one body into a computer? The hard problem complicates our understanding of consciousness by suggesting that the nature of conscious experience is not entirely reducible to physical phenomena, which in turn suggests that we do not have a definitive answer about whether or not consciousness can completely cease after or when death occurs. Because according to a physicalist it does, but if the hard problem of consciousness complicates this fact, then it raises questions of this nature. There are also several alternative theories to consciousness that try to respond to the hard problem. We know, of course, about dualism. Dualism holds that the mind or the soul and the body are distinct, and that therefore consciousness is not purely physical. This means that the mind can exist independently of the body and may be able to continue after death. There is also a theory that we're going to explore in a future lesson known as panpsychism. Now, proponents of panpsychism argues that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, akin to the idea of space or time or mass or energy. If consciousness is not tied to complex brain structures, but is instead part of the intrinsic feature of all matter, then even after death, it might be said that consciousness could continue in a form, or one form or another, or transition into another state, which means that death does not necessarily represent the end of conscious experience, but rather represents maybe a change or a transformation in that experience from one thing to another thing, just like mass or matter can change from that of energy, and things change and develop over time. Finally, then, you have some contemporary thinkers, like neuroscientists, who propose theories such as the IIT theory, the integrated information theory, which suggests that consciousness arises from the integration of information within a system. So, according to IIT, consciousness depends on the patterns of information processing and not merely on physical substrates, which could lead to a speculation that in certain circumstances, consciousness could continue to take place even where there is the death of the brain. So it could take place in different forms. This is a contentious theory, does not provide definitive answers to the hard problem of consciousness, but is still nevertheless a theory which might have some backing when thinking about more contemporary neuroscience. More on that in future videos.